Okay, religion and astronomy, and Carter, Deuteronomy, Einstein and astrology, it all started with the Big Bang. Well, that's what the song says. What about the scriptures? What do the scriptures say? What does Vedanta say? And we have quite a journey ahead of us. In the next hour, we have to get from the Big Bang theory to yoga, the union of the outer and the inner worlds. In the Rig Veda, they start out and they say in the hymn of creation, who knows who created this world? Maybe the gods know, but then again, they, being after the creation of this world, may not know themselves. And how about the being that created this world? Again, in verse 10, it says, he may know, but then again, he may not. So if the gods and the creator do not know how this world came about, who are we to speculate? What conclusions can we draw? And what does it mean for our spiritual journey? So we have three verses here from three different scriptures. First from the Rig Veda, which says, darkness covering darkness existed at the beginning. And from Genesis, in the beginning, the earth was desolate and formless, and darkness was covering everything. This idea of darkness covering darkness appears in many scriptures. And even in the New Testament, it says, if the light in you is dark, then the darkness will be doubly dark. And finally, our verse from the Tao Te Ching. From the perspective of nothingness, one may perceive the expansion of the universe. One may distinguish individual things. Both are for the conceptual convenience of the mind. And this is actually closer to the Vedantic teachings, where we see that concepts such as a non-transforming transformation of pure consciousness are taught in the Advaita. And this gives rise to examples such as seeing a snake where there is only a rope, or seeing a ghost where there is only a post. And in the Mundaka Upanishad, they say that this waking state is as transient and illusory as the dreams that we have at the night. The scriptures then proceed, however, let there be light, and there was light. And if we take this verse word for word, we can learn a lot from it. So God said, well, first that implies a sentient being had to be present. Before you can speak a word, you have to think the word. Therefore, it's a conscious sentient being. And then the word itself preceded the light, and it exploded into what we see around us. The Rig Veda continuing, just a couple of verses from the hymn of creation. Then there was not non-existent, nor existence. There was no realm of air, no sky beyond it. What covered in and where? What gave shelter? Was water there? Unfathomed depth of water. Death was not then, nor was there aught immortal. No sign was there, as the day and night's divider. That one thing, breathless, breathed by its own nature. Apart from it, nothing whatsoever. There were begetters, there were mighty forces, free action here and energy up yonder. Who verily knows and who can declare it, whence it was born and whence comes this creation? The gods are later in this world's production. Who knows then whence it first came into being? He, the first origin of this creation, whether he formed it all or did not form it, whose eyes control this world in the highest heaven. Verily he knows it, or perhaps he does not. Two of the key words that the sages do use in their explanation of the origins are first, Vicasa Expansion. So something starts from an infinitesimal point and expands into all that we see. The other word, Sankocha, contraction, and we heard that in the song. One day it will go the other way and make an even bigger bang. And on the Friday class, we started the Kano Upanishad series, Swami Yogatmananda, on Friday night. We added one more word to this, Brahman, which comes from the root brer, which means to grow, to support, or to bear, in the sense of carrying the load. So Brahman is carrying the load of this whole structure. Now, the idea of Big Bang also leads to the concept of an origin or center. And this isn't hard to imagine. Just think of perhaps seeing a rock thrown into a pond of water. That's the center. That's the impulse. From there radiates outward the rings, the waves that propagate out to the shores. Or think of fireworks that you may have seen on a holiday celebration. There's a flash of light and then a radiating field of embers in different colors, which create the pattern that the fireworks designer intended to do in that particular firework. Observing the radiating things, maybe just a small piece of the wave hitting the shore or just one or two of the radiating elements of the firework explosion, we can ask, can we trace this back to the originating point? In other words, what is the center? And the center of the universe, finding the center of the universe, has fascinated philosophers and scientists over the centuries. And now each searcher for truth in this regard may have had a particular agenda, but all in some sense were truly trying to discover what is the center of the universe. Isaac Newton, one of the greatest contributors to physics, was also in search of religious truths. And he was said to be fascinated by alchemy as well. So I'm going to show you the center of the universe. This is a model, a 16th century model. Other than the person in the 12 o'clock position, which is the meditating person, the map is authentic. And you can see from it, there are many religious icons. In the upper left is a crucifix. In the upper right, a father-like God figure. The entire picture is surrounded by cherubs and angels, indicating the heavenly realms. It is a mix of religion and science. The earth, however, is in the center. And this was an idea first put forth by Aristotle, that the universe was geocentric. The earth was in the center, and everything else went around the earth. And that was endorsed by the church. But around this time, in the 16th century, Copernicus and other astronomers were beginning to propose a heliocentric universe, the sun being at the center, which got a lot of resistance from the church. And that's going to bring us to Swami Vivekananda. And he wrote it nicely, so I'm just going to quote it from him rather than paraphrase it. He says, "We all know the theories of the cosmos according to the modern astronomers and physicists. At the same time, we all know how woefully they undermine the theology of Europe, how these scientific discoveries that are made act as a bomb thrown at its strongholds. And we know how theologians have in all times attempted to put down these researches." But then he goes on and asks a provocative question. He says, "Is religion to justify itself by the discoveries of reason through which every other science justifies itself? Are the same methods of investigation which we apply to science and knowledge outside to be applied to the science of religion?" And he answers affirmatively. He says, yes, it must be so. And I am of the opinion that the sooner that it is done, the better. If a religion is destroyed by such investigations, it was all of the time useless, unworthy, superstition, and the sooner it goes, the better. I am thoroughly convinced that its destruction would be the best thing that could happen. All of the dross will be removed, and the religion will emerge stronger from the process. Sometimes around New Year's Eve or New Year's around the turn of the calendar, we have an expression, out with the old and in with the new. Maybe in context with Swami Vivekananda's words here, maybe we can tweak it just a little bit and say, out with the old and in with the true, provided, of course, that there's some defect or some deficiency in the old. So now we can ask, is this model, this earth-centric model of the universe from the 16th century, is it close to the truth told by Vedanta? Or is the modern cosmology, with us on the wing of the Milky Way galaxy, closer to the truth? Let's survey the knowledge of, search for knowledge in the West. So if we go around this picture, we see starting in about the 10 o'clock position and the 11 o'clock position, two explorers. We have to ask the question, what makes a person leave their home, take a journey over horizons unknown? What are they searching for? Why take some risks? Well, Columbus, who was in the 11 o'clock position, we know he was in search of India and her treasures, actually, which is why the first people he encountered on this continent were first given the name American Indians. He was in search of India. The thinker-philosopher in the 12 o'clock position journeys in a more subtle realm, the world of ideas. But there they're searching for aesthetic ideals of beauty and truth and what constitutes a valid society. Coming around to the geologist's hammer, to the microscope, to the chemistry set. This is an analysis of the world based on composition. What are things made of? How do they interact? Investigation by reduction and taking things apart. And it's not an obsolete matter, even to this day. At the Center for Nuclear Energy Research, CERN, in Geneva, Switzerland, they have a 17-mile in diameter tunnel of superconducting magnets called the Large Hadron Collider. And in this very day, they're searching for something called the Higgs boson, sometimes referred to as the God particle. And to get an idea of what this 17-mile in diameter structure is looking for, take a meter, or 39 inches, and divide it 1,000,000 times. Take one of those pieces and divide it another 1,000,000 times. And take one of those pieces and divide it almost another 1,000,000 times. So it takes a 17-mile in diameter structure to look for something that is almost indescribably small. It's kind of an interesting fact in physics. Sometimes to look for smaller and smaller items, we need bigger and bigger devices. You can think of the size of a telescope. The larger the telescope, the farther off back in time that you can see. And the reason I say back in time is because of the propagation delay of light, right? We talk about things being light years away. So when you look at the night sky, you're looking back at least 4 years, except for the moon, because the nearest star is 4 light years away. The closest star is 4 light years away. And so we can have some fun with this inverse relationship a little bit true, because we say truth is infinite. Therefore, we would have to reduce ourselves to 0 size or complete abnegation of our ego to truly find it. Just continuing around the circle, we have the spaceship. Where else can we go? How far? Is there life anywhere else? And where could we go if or when this earth is destroyed? And lastly on this slide, information as a commodity. The web, the internet, is continually changing. I don't know if you've experienced it, but every time you go to a web page, there's new information there. It can be updated by anybody. So it's an evolving thing. And data is coming out, especially with these new cell phones and new devices, that we're really becoming hypnotized to some degree by these devices. People checking their phone 100, 200, 3 times a day is what the data is showing. And many accessing their phones within the first 15 minutes of waking up. So it's interesting data. But in all of this, what's missing? It's the question of who is doing the questioning. Who is searching for the truth? Who is seeking the truth? So what is clear is humankind does search for meanings. And Vivekananda says, just as the Greek mind or the modern European mind wants to find the solution of life and to the sacred problems of being by searching the external world, so did our forefathers. And just as the Europeans failed, they failed too. But the Western people never made a move more, and there they remained stranded. Our forefathers also found it impossible, but they were bolder in declaring the utter helplessness of the senses to find the solution. So Swami Vivekananda preceded Swami Ranganathananda, who then said the following: science and religion, when relied on separately, can be counterproductive. Combined harmoniously, they lead humankind to genius and total fulfillment. But as we have seen, this relationship has not historically been harmonious. So the key points are the sacred problems of being are common to all people. The helplessness of the senses, because they're measuring instruments. All measuring instruments have measurement error, noise, and bias. But the how and why of this search really will determine whether a society becomes increasingly sophisticated, advanced, and enlightened, or becomes mired in dogma and ideology. So the how and why of this search really determines, did we take the common road, or to steal a phrase, did we take the road less traveled? And if the senses are truly helpless, how should we proceed for these sacred problems of being? And we're going to examine that. Before we do, though, I would just like to quickly survey the successes of the physical sciences. Here we sit in springtime in a comfort of a climate-controlled room. We have automation of manual tasks, efficiencies in farming and production. And science has given us the ability to manipulate some of the universal forces for our own benefit. But with all of the technological and material successes, there still is an overwhelming spiritual dissatisfaction. Carl Jung wrote, "Modern Man in Search of a Soul." And just a survey of any library of the self-help books, the therapy groups, pills, and other escapes that folks resort to is an indication that there is this legitimate dissatisfaction. And perhaps even fear of aloneness now, where we can't be without that feedback from that instant email or that instant message. But not only is it not satisfying, Swami Raghunathananda raises the stakes a little bit. He says, he defines two terms. One he calls technical efficiency, and one he calls moral efficiency. Technical efficiency is control over external nature, which modern science has given us a great deal of. Moral efficiency is control over our own inner nature. And the balance, based on Swami Raghunathan's analysis, is far too much on the technical side. And so there's a spiritual need arising in the current society. And this imbalance is really thwarting humanity's urge for fulfillment. And he says that even if humanity is not destroyed, life is a search from one sorrow and unfulfillment to another. However, the story is good. There are signs for hope. Because even while confronted by and engaged in tackling the mystery of the external universe, we are seeing that modern science is becoming impressed with a deeper mystery, the mystery of the world within. And this gives us hope. And I'm going to focus a little bit on this now. So since Swami Vivekananda's day, and even since dear Swami Raghunathananda, there have been some new developments in quantum mechanics and neuroscience, which I want to share with you tonight. So we talked a little bit about the search for the God particle and this hadron reaction as a flow of energy. So it's no longer an object, a thing like a pen or a clicker or a book, but it's more an event which ties back to the Hindu concept of sphota, sound and vibration. So at the above atomic level, the level we're experiencing now, things are relatively stable. I don't expect this podium to self-disintegrate, although the laws of physics allow for a certain probability that it could do that. But below, at the subatomic levels, all matter is a sea of energy resonances coming and going. And we heard that in the Rig Veda earlier, actually, right? This all was indiscriminate chaos. All that existed was void and formless. There were begetters and mighty forces, free action and energy up yonder. Now we're going to do an experiment, one of two that we're going to do tonight. So I'll ask the question. You all experienced something. Did the note exist? Does it still exist? As an object, we would probably say it doesn't exist. There was nothing you could grab a hold of, nothing you could pick up. But you experienced something. We, as human beings, experience these vibrations, sense these vibrations, and create an experience from it. Vedanta says similarly about dreams, actually. they rise up and fall away. I had a very interesting one last night. Given the shortness of time, I'll spare you the details. But it's gone now from my experience. And as real as it was at the moment, it's no longer here. The Mundaka Upanishad says the same thing about this waking state. And Vedanta says all things that can be ascribed a name or a form is a long line with that vibration that came out of that gong a few minutes ago. Now, the question, do these elementary particles in energy physics have structure, is sort of a contemporary question in this field. And we can ask, well, what is the implication of a yes answer or a no answer? Particles must have some structure or property if we're going to attribute something to them. For example, to say a certain region of the space-time is something called hydrogen, we ascribe it certain properties, like it can explode very easily, think of the Hindenburg, or oxygen, which fuels fires and things. But then if we bring those two regions of space-time together and add a little bit more energy, they combine into something called water, which has different properties, again, from either hydrogen and oxygen. But from a Vedantic point of view, these are names and forms given to unreal, temporal, and momentary things. So what we might want to call momentary notes of a universal song. So we'll look a little bit more at the energy physics piece before, and then we'll go to neuroscience. So Vedanta's point of view is that structurelessness and indivisibility cannot be the structure of matter, energy, or space or time. They use the word mithya. Anything that possesses internal structure is unreal or falsifiable because they're objects of knowledge. And they're changing from moment to moment, just like that vibration that came out of the gong. Sri Ramakrishna also said it. He said there is much confusion in his world of Maya. No one can say for sure that this will cause that, or that will come after this, which calls into the basic question, the perceived linearity or forward progression of time. In sciences also, relativity also calls that into question. And quantum mechanics is beginning to incorporate the observer into its equations too. And because of this, well, again, on our Friday night class on the Kano Upanishad, Swami Yogatmarananda pointed this out last Friday night. He said because matter, energy, space-time, anything which possesses structure is unreal, that the Western science approach goes on indefinitely. You can continue to smash things to bits and bits and bits and pieces, as we just did, 1,000,000 divided by 1,000,000 divided by 1,000,000. But that'll keep going from the point of view of Vedanta. So we need a different method. I'll change topics a little bit now and get into the recent experiences in neuroscience, and there's been some really good work going on. Particularly in the lab, there's 3 areas that are of current interest with regarding creating what they call out-of-body experiences by stimulating certain parts of the brain. The work of Henrik Ersson from Sweden at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm actually uses, it's very fascinating, probes and cameras and things, and was able to successfully displace a person's sense of self. And I'm just going to quote now from a scientific writer who attended his lab. He said, "Using little more than a video camera, goggles, and 2 sticks, he has convinced me that I'm floating a few meters behind my own body." And Ersson's work is really intriguing to neuroscientists and philosophers because it begins to get at this construct of self, things that we were originally thought untouchable by what we call the hard scientists. This work is being applied in an area called advanced prosthetics. And because they are beginning to exploit the fact that they can create the presence of an object that seems to be owned by the person, they are looking to do that. And there's a work called Phantoms in the Brain by Ramachandran out of the University of California at Berkeley that talks about this. And then there's one more person, Olaf Blank. And I'm going to read a little bit from his abstract. He had published a paper in the Journal of Neuroscience in January 2005 titled "Linking Out-of-Body Experience and Self-Processing to Mental Own body imagery at the temporal-parietal junction. Okay? And so, just quoting from his abstract here, folk psychology postulates a unity between self and body, a real me that resides in one body and is the subject of experience. Cognitive psychologists and philosophers have challenged this assumption and defined several conceptual and phenomenological aspects of the self, including the feeling of being positioned at a certain space and time. Right now, I believe that I am positioned behind a podium talking to a group of folks that are outward from me, that I'm in a certain space, and each of you have your own perspective. You believe you're seeing somebody at a podium giving a talk, perhaps. And so they have all of these assumptions. So what he did, what Olaf Blanc did, was he used a technique called transcranial direct current stimulation, which just basically means he puts a probe here and a little bit here and sends a little bit of current through the person's brain at the specific point that he's studying. So Ehrson studies the ventral premotor cortex, but Olaf Blanc is studying the temporal-parietal junction, which is located about here. And his results, he basically quoting here, with the use of evoked potential mapping, we show the selective activation of the temporal-parietal junction at 300 to 400 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. Healthy volunteers imagine themselves in a position and visual perspective that are reported by people experiencing spontaneous out-of-body experiences. This is kind of interesting work. And it goes back to what we talked about on Friday night, again, in our lecture on the Kenobi Upanishad, where Swami says, basically our brain has a program that runs. And it's evolved this way so that it integrates the visual with the audio to create our picture of the world. But he also told us we accept it far too much for granted. We accept it far too much for granted. And it creates this illusion of Maya that the sages warn us about. Okay? So modern science is now beginning to poke at this a little bit and beginning to understand that this brain's program can be manipulated, something that the ancient sages have told us. You are not this body. Okay, now I want to show you a little bit of Olaf Blanc's words here. And I have a video from his presentation at his conference. We're going to play the video, and then you stop it when we get to the guy. Is that something you can do? I'm not sure if I can do it correctly from here. Okay, so I'm going to start the video, and we'll stop it. Another one. Maybe, can you do it from there? Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, can you start it, please?
As I've told you already before, is that the body representation of the brain is the most crucial. And if I play you the next video, please, then you will see a very simple example how we can change what is self and what is...
Stop it there. So I'm going to, he does his explanation at the end. I'm going to do the explanation up front because what happens so quickly. If you know what's happening first, you'll see it, you'll understand it better. So what's happening is there's a subject in a blue t-shirt there. He's got his hands out in front of him. One is in his peripheral vision. What would be his right hand is in his peripheral vision. But his true left hand is behind that screen. So it's out of his peripheral vision. Instead, they placed a third hand, a rubber hand, that is in his vision. So he sees one fake hand, which appears to be his left hand, and his true right hand, and his true left hand is hidden. Do you get it? Okay? And what they do is then they take and they stroke the fake hand and his real hand up and down like this, and create an association in his brain between the rubber hand, the not self, but it becomes his self, so convincingly that watch what happens.
Not self. Look in particular at the left arm of the blue subject. So first of all, it's always if you play this with sound, it's even more fun. But I mean, first of all, neuroscientists can have fun in the laboratory. That's already a good thing. Not so sure about the blues person. If you can stop the video right now, I can explain you what is actually done. This is a simple...
Okay, so he goes on to explain it. I explained it beforehand, but it's out on YouTube if you want to see it again. But if you could see the person that underwent that experience close up, how visually shaken that person was for up to 30 seconds. So what happened, I don't know if you caught it, a person walked in with a fork or a knife and stabbed that rubber hand. But so strong was his association that this piece of rubber was me, he felt threatened to the point where it physically shook him up. Right? And the sages tell us, you are not this body. But how intense do we associate ourselves with this body so that we fear? That's what Vedanta says. So much of what we do is driven by fear for the preservation of this, which is not us. Okay. So now I want to go on a little bit. I'm going to change topics slightly. We're going to come back to this. We're actually going to do an experiment later on that you'll be able to participate in right from your seats. But before we get to do that, before we get there, I got to build another bridge to another concept. And we're going to talk about Vedanta's evolution of consciousness. God said, let there be light, and there was light. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and God created all that we see in John. And from Paramahansa Yogananda, the light of intelligent life energy, the Word, is the first manifestation of cosmic consciousness. When it vibrates more grossly, it becomes the electrons, protons, and atoms. The sun and the moon and the fire are composed of these. Cosmic energy is made from cosmic consciousness, and therefore the mind of spirit manifests as sun, moon, and all objects. Now, according to Vedanta, we know there is only one reality, oneness of consciousness, which is fundamental, and everything else is temporary, momentary forms, as we've seen with the gong. This is the idea of sphota and vibrations. So more akin to the musical notes, which we already discussed. And so we have to proceed in Vedanta from Sat, which is existence. So I have in this picture here, basically Sat. This has consciousness, but at the most rudimentary level. We wouldn't say two rocks are aware of each other's presence. But the diamond on the end is about the highest evolutionary point. If we were dirt or minerals, our God would be a diamond because it represents the highest capabilities. Why? A diamond has unequal qualities among the minerals. It's the hardest known substance. It's the greatest conductor of heat. It has the highest melting point of any substance that we know of, and the highest refractive index, which is why it's so valuable as jewelry, because of the way it processes and reflects light. So if we were minerals or dirt, our God would be a diamond. And in fact, there's a song in the pop culture these days that goes shine bright like a diamond, right, along that idea, reveal the inner brilliance of your spirit. But to this Sat, we are going to then add Sat and Chit. Chit is where the entities begin to have some awareness of their environment. And we know even plants, even the sunflowers that grow out on our back during the summertime, the heads follow the sun. So they have, even though it's only a plant, they have some awareness of the environment. Okay? So that's what we say, Sat and Chit. It's awareness consciousness. And in Yoga and Vedanta, there's sort of a hierarchy of these vibrations that Yogananda just talked about. Ether is the most subtle, the most rare, which becomes air, which is coarser, fire, which is more coarser, fire to water, and then water to solids, which is the grossest vibration. Now, Vedanta says that if the whole universe is a product of a self-evolving cause, whether that self-evolving cause is energy, as the quantum physicists say, or consciousness, as the Vedantists say, that whatever it is, that one cause must account for everything, all subjects, all objects, and all experience. And that wisdom comes from Swami Raghunathananda, who also introduces this next topic, which has fascinated me more recently, this idea of homeostasis. Homeostasis, we're going to talk about two types tonight. The first is that which nature gave us basically for free, and it's the auto-functioning of our body, the maintaining of temperature, the ions, our body chemistry. When we eat food, body digests it without conscious involvement. And what that did for the mammals and the creatures is it freed the frontal lobe, the frontal cortex, made it available for more creative and more advanced processing. Okay, and this is important when we get into the yoga aspect of tonight's talk later on. So I've hit you with a lot of stuff so far. Hopefully you've been following along reasonably well. I'm going to sum it up real quick here. First question we asked is reality an unconscious collection of quantum energy, bullets, combining and recombining by chance, or a unified consciousness field as proposed by Vedanta? We asked, where is the center of the universe? Can we find it? Are we fitted to determine it and find it? We introduced the idea of quantum mechanics and neuroscience as topics in the modern investigative process which are beginning to build a bridge between what we call the hard scientists and some of the conclusions of the ancient rishis which Vedanta presents to us. Okay? They're beginning to converge, these two ideas. And so I have on the next chart a quotation from Frank Laloux in a 2012 book, Do We Really Understand Quantum Mechanics? And he basically says that solution to Schrödinger's wave equation, which is one of the key equations in particle physics, describe not only molecular, atomic, and subatomic systems, but also macroscopic systems, possibly the whole universe. So we're beginning to converge what the old Western hard sciences and the old ancient Vedic sciences. And now, one more idea here that Swami Ranganatha put forth was that, well, first we should talk about Sankhya. So the difference between Vedantic philosophy and Sankhya is that Vedanta makes the final resolution of the duality into a singular, right, a one, whereas Sankhya retains a little bit of the duality. They talk about Purusha, soul, and Prakriti, material. Vedanta takes it one level back and resolves the two into a pure consciousness. But Sankhya retains the duality. And so Swami Ranganathananda says here that modern subphysics is now in the position of ancient Sankhya, reducing truths to at least this duality. And he says the Vedantic truth of the unity of the consciousness field will be revealed to the subatomic physicists when it resolves its present contradiction. And what is that contradiction? It's viewing the observer, the person doing the experiment, in terms of classical physics, while the observed is viewed in terms of the probabilities of the quantum field. So he's saying we're getting close, but we haven't quite got to where Vedanta is, but maybe where Sankhya is. So the next couple of minutes will probably be the toughest part of the talk. I think we're going to work through some of the equations of the quantum mechanics here. Okay, so let's start. Maybe not.
Principles of electron motion were beyond everyone's grasp. Be thankful it's just a grade. In most places, this kind of performance gets you a spanking that still burns when you're blown out the airlock. Dr. Solomon, are you at least going to grade us on a curve? Of course not. I grade on a transient loop. What? It's very simple. Your expected score is located here. The parameters of your actual performance are here, here, and here, driving the expectation versus performance data into the last 3 loops, 2 of which can't be seen because, of course, they're factored only into the time.
So is my A still an A?
Oh, Karen. No. This shouldn't be all that difficult for you. The interactions of elementary particles are far simpler than the interactions between people.
Okay, so I really didn't want to do the equations of theoretical physics. I just wanted sort of a mid-talk relief from all of the heavy stuff. But his tagline, his walk away, is where I do want to go next. And that is, the interactions of elementary particles are far more simpler than the interaction of between people. And so that's where we're going to go next with the talk. We're going to look a little bit about evolution from a human perspective and what it takes, okay? To do that, I'm going to introduce it by way of a song, just a little bit more of a mid-talk sort of break here. And there's a story in the Jungle Book. Maybe you're familiar with it, a children's story. It's a very nice story, actually. And there's this young orphan boy named Mowgli, and he was found sleeping in a basket in the jungles of India. And so he was raised, being an orphan, he was raised by a wolf, a mother wolf, and had little baby wolves for his brother. And they called him, all the animals called him Man Cub, because he was a young man. And so one night, a man-eating tiger came to the jungle. And so the wolves who were caring for Mowgli said, well, we better take you back to your man village to be safe. And then a fun-loving bear called Baloo comes along, and he says, well, no, I'll take care of you, Mowgli. I'm not going to let them take you back to your man village. But then a group of monkeys come along, and they kidnap Mowgli, and they take him to the leader. And so the leader's name is King Louie, who is an orange, big orange orangutan. And he was called king because he was the highest evolved of all the jungle animals. And he had a lot of material things, and he lived in a palace, but he wasn't happy. And so he asked Mowgli, he said, can you teach me how to go beyond my animal nature and become like a man? And then he sings a song called I Want to Be Like You. So we're going to play that song now. Yep. Okay, so kind of interesting words there. The fact that they were all in orange was kind of extra credit by the graphic artist there. But what is man's red fire that he was asking for? Okay, what is the power to go beyond the animal nature and assume the next nature? So that's going to be the focus of the rest of the talk. Okay, there we go. So that's where we left off. And we are now going to pick up the third of the triad, Sat, Chit, and Dhamma. So Dhamma here is basically adding the quality to see others as subjects, not just objects for our own manipulation. But when we truly can learn to see others as subjects, is said by Swami Ranganathananda to be the prerequisite into something we call the inner journey, the Lokatara, and achieving this thing we call the second homeostasis. And that's what we're going to talk about So how do we proceed? Well, yoga is the way, and really what we're going to talk about is the obstacles. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell compared strong individuals to billiard balls. And he said, the only relationship billiard balls can have with each other are collisions. Okay? But Swami Ranganathananda, in Eternal Values for a Changing Society, says, to be able to communicate and to live at peace, there is a need for an individual to grow into a person. And this is a spiritual growth, not just physical, not just intellectual. It transcends genetic or organic limitations. So even if at the subatomic level the universe is a colliding and recombining set of energy, at the human level we have to do better than that, okay? So we're going to talk now about two journeys. One is called Loka, the outer journey, and the other one is Lokatar, the inner journey. And union is the union of yoga is the union of these two. So let's take a look at the outer journey first, and just kind of go around the chart. So starting at an infinite might see the world, hands and feet. At first, its own hands and feet may show up into its visual perspective, and it may, in the very beginning, not even associate that hand with I. Right? Just like we saw in the video earlier, the person did associate a non-object with the I. Early on in infancy, you may not associate this. It's a learned behavior. But then as you come around, the person grows up a little bit, begins to develop some likes and dislikes. I like this food and that food. You know, if any of you have children, you all know how creating meals can sometimes be challenging, unless you do 7 days of pizza every night. But this is the part of the progression, right? Beginning to become an individual. But at this point, we're still at what we call the unripe ego, or and the progression is towards the ripe ego. Later, she gets a little bit older. She begins to develop certain likes. Maybe she has a taste and a skill set in the musical realm, first using it for her own enjoyment. But then she begins to become a person, a personality. And this is where the Dhamma comes in, where you start seeing others as individuals and start treating others, helping others, working with others. And lastly, all of your skills combined into what we will call your vocation. So maybe because she had a talent in music, maybe she went on to be a professional singer there. So that's sort of the healthy progression. We know it always doesn't go always that smoothly. There can be obstacles and blocks at each one of these steps, depending on your environment, the people you're exposed to. You know, one example that came to mind fairly recently was that personality Robin Williams last summer. He had committed suicide, and yet from the outside in, and I won't certainly speak to understand his life, but from the outside in, it appears he had all of the things we think we want. Right? Money, fame, he was respected by his peer group, had a fairly good fortune, nice-looking family, a wife, daughter, son. And still, there was some still unfulfilled need or some dissatisfaction, as Swami Ranganatha had already pointed out, because success in the material and technical efficiencies without the equivalent success in the moral efficiencies, quoting, lead from one unfulfillment to another, from one dissatisfaction to another, from one sorrow to another. But this is the outer journey. At some point, we get a call for the inner journey, what we'll call Krishna's call to the higher consciousness. And I'm going to quote now from Swami Ranganathananda. As a product of evolution, humankind is a unique specimen, holding the key to the mystery of nature, to the purpose of evolution, and to the meaning of all existence. The psychophysical system is a miniature universe in itself. The immensity of its inner dimension is obscured by the smallness of the external covering. In other words, there's a lot more to us inside than our outer physical size of, some 4, 5, 6 feet would imagine. And we hit that as we go into these spiritual studies. The Upanishads describe it as a soul riding in a chariot. It says here in the Katha Upanishad, know the self to be sitting in the chariot, the body to be the chariot, the intellect to be the charioteer, and the mind the reins. The senses they call the horses. And so what I tried to depict here was that verse. And if you look at the person in the middle doing the meditation, the goal of meditation is to make your mind as stable as a flame in a windless place, is the way it's described. It shouldn't flicker. It should be stable like a flame in the windless place. And we have two competing forces pulling at us. The senses pulling us outward, which is what I've depicted by the horses there, and Krishna and the flute trying to lure us inside with the peace that surpasses understanding. So we come again, we're going to revisit this idea of homeostasis now. So the first one we've seen already. It's achieved by nature, the first homeostasis. It's physical in character. It's basically controlling our chemistry, our temperature, regulated chemistry. But it freed our upper body, our upper frontal lobes for creative thinking. The second homeostasis requires self-effort. Nature doesn't give it for free. It's mental in character. It requires a stable moral life. This is what the sages teach us. They use three words: sama, meaning calmness; dhamma, meaning self-discipline; and dharma, right living. And a definition of yoga is provided there. Yoga as equanimity of mind. Samatman yoga uchate. So what prevents us from this second homeostasis? So we talk about drags of the organic system. And there's two words here, vasana and samskar. And so I'm going to quote now from Swami Ranganathananda. The science of raising consciousness is more thrilling adventure and more rewarding than space flight. During the raising of consciousness, we come across one important truth, namely the constant experience of a drag downwards and the need for more increasing energy to achieve lift. And so it's interesting that he uses this space flight analogy. So I have in the inset there this little equation, V sub E, which stands for the escape velocity. And so in rocket science, in order to escape the gravitational pull of a planet or something you're trying to get away from, you need a certain amount of velocity called the escape velocity. And that's basically the amount of energy that you have, the kinetic energy you have, is equal or greater to the gravitational potential of the planet or thing that's trying to hold you in place. So in spiritual life, it's the same thing, and that's why I found it interesting that Swami Ranganathananda used this space flight analogy. So we have to come up with this energy to overcome these vasanas and samskars. And so I promised you one more experiment, and the time has come. We're going to do an experiment about these vasanas and samskars. You'll do it right there in your seat. It's safe. Nothing's going to happen. Well, something will happen, but nothing dangerous or risky will happen. I'll just give you a minor warning just as a precaution, because it is going to involve taking your finger and putting it near your eye. So anybody who has concern about infections, because they do say that, putting your hands near your eyes, you can pick up colds and flus. So if you do have a concern about catching an infection, you can just listen to the instructions and try it from home. But if you don't, you can try it here. So the experiment is this. Fix your eyes, find some object in the room at a distant point from you, kind of lock on that object, and then using your brain, move your eyes slightly from left to right, but never take your eye off the object. Try not to lose track of the object. Okay, do that a few times. Okay, when you get a sense of what's happening there, now we're going to do it again. I want you to do it with your finger this time. And I don't want you to push on your eye, on the glass part of your eye, but push on the skin next to your eye, and move your eye left or right about the same distance that you were doing it with your mind's control. Let's move it back and forth a little bit and see what you notice. Okay, everybody had a chance to try it? Anybody want to volunteer what they observed? Yes, please.
I had a physical feeling. I felt like I was moving.
You felt like you were moving, okay. During which part?
When I pushed on my eye.
When you pushed on your eye.
I felt it in my whole body, and when I just looked at it, it was outside.
Okay, interesting. All right, so what we see, and so what's going on here, this experiment was first proposed by German physicist Hermann Helmholtz back in the 1800s. And what he was proposing there was that before your brain creates an action, it creates a mental copy of that action called an efference or a reference copy, so that it knows when you go execute the real action from your motor system, it has something to compare it to. And so as she just explained, you probably observed one of two things. Either you felt like you were moving, or you saw a displacement of the object that you were looking at when you were doing it with your finger, but not when you're doing it with your mind control. Why? Our biology has evolved such that when the brain moves the eye, it knows it needs to compensate for the motion. So our biology, our evolution says, whenever I move these things called eyes, I'm going to compensate the visual field. But we did not evolve to associate the movement of a finger with having to change the spatial environment. So when we move our finger, the brain does not realize it has to compensate the visual field. Okay? So what does all this have to do with yoga and Vedanta, you're probably wondering? Well, first of all, the saints and sages tell us, be careful what you think about. Because even thinking about an act, say robbing a bank, leaves this residual samskara, this vasana, in our mind. And that's what we face, and that's what we deal with in meditation. So yes, from a legal and ethical point, if we don't actually go out and rob the bank, we're probably in somewhat better than if we did. But from a psychology and yoga standpoint, thinking about these things leave the residual impressions, which we then go face during meditation. Okay, so these are the drags of the organic system that they're calling vasana and samskara. Okay, so we just did this experiment by Helmholtz. And just on the inset here, it says, a monk meditating, human agency, the ability to affect the surrounding world, may be a result, not so simply of conscious choice, but instead a result of training unconscious habits beforehand. And sometimes you may have heard the phrase self-defeating psychology, or things where the subconscious mind actually sets you on a path for failure or unsuccess in a certain endeavor if you don't conquer it, right? And so we're talking about conquering these kind of things in this yoga science. So more on the drag. So I'm again quoting from Swami Ranganathananda. Overcoming the drag of the gravitational pulls of the organic system and raising consciousness to higher levels is a slow and steady process. It has to be treated as a converging life endeavor. It cannot be done by magic or tricks or psychedelic drugs. Some people try to achieve it by high emotional excitements, but it doesn't help. Consciousness eventually comes down when the excitement is abated and falls even further down. And I got one more equation in here and one more picture that wasn't in Swami Ranganatha's book, but it's related to this idea. And so this is the Apollo 11 shot, and it's doing something called staging. So if you're familiar with rocket flight, in order to get to this escape velocity that you need, you have to start shedding things. And so they can go so far on the first booster, and then they have to cut it off and ignite the second booster to get to that escape velocity, which they needed to get to the moon. They were trying to escape the gravitational field of the Earth to go to the moon. And so in spiritual science, it's the same thing. It might be called renunciation, but we have to start shedding our attachments to these organic satisfactions and some of these sanskaras and vasanas that we have built up over our lifetime. And that is what the journey, the challenge is. So meditation and these spiritual practices harmonize or create a union between our outer world, our outer journey, and our inner journey. So just kind of walking around the graphic. In the outer world, we have duty and service that we do to others, do for others. Happiness and recreation, we all want to be happy and have some enjoyments in life. We have worship, which is sort of a bridging. And then the inner world, the Lokatara, is the meditation. It brings us inspiration and creativity, Dhamma, and the ability to relate to others truly as subjects and not as objects. and a sort of spontaneous ongoing joy and bliss as we master this science comes about. They're not mutually exclusive, but they go together to make this life an interesting experience for us. So I got two more charts. We talked a little bit about quantum physics, and one of the key contributors, we already looked at his equation a few times, was Erwin Schrödinger. Well, he wrote a book called What is Life? And very interesting what he wrote there. He said, consciousness is never experienced in the plural, only in the singular. Consciousness finds itself intimately connected with and dependent on a limited region of matter. My consciousness seems to be limited to this region. Your consciousness seems to be limited to the regions where you're all sitting, each of you. And it would appear this great plurality of bodies would suggest a hypothesis that consciousness exists in plural form. He then goes on and describes a whole bunch of his objections, philosophical objections to this. And by the way, he was a reader and had exposure to the Upanishads and some of these things. But he finally concludes in the following way, which is very nice. The only possible alternative to multi-consciousness and multi-bodies is that there is only one thing, and what appears to be a plurality is merely a series of different aspects of this one thing. And that's from Erwin Schrödinger, his book, What is Life? So let's now come to the conclusion of the talk and the culmination of Vedantic and yoga teachings. I have a few quotes here. The first is from George Furstein's book, Yoga, the Technology of Ecstasy. And he says here, the yogi discovers experientially his own body is a vast sea of psychophysical energy and experiences the reality behind the mathematical models of modern quantum physics. And it's kind of interesting that that ties together. In the bold, oh, I'm sorry, this did not change for you? Okay, there it is. Okay, so I just read the top one. In Sanskrit there, tat vamasi, thou art that. Okay, and I have a couple of more quotes. I will go give each of my authors or the persons from whom I researched this the final say. So from Paramahansa Yogananda, God Talks with Arjuna, he says, a yogi is a possessor of true wisdom who understands that God is the one perceiver in creation, singularly and in all souls, encased in physical bodies, the only subject, perceptive, and objective principle. He is the cognitive principle in all sentient creatures. In all sentient creatures and everything else. And then next from Swami Vivekananda, The Complete Works. A solution of the universal problem as we can get from the outside is our own particular view. Our senses are limited, so we don't get the whole view. Our only hopes lie in penetrating deeper. We must first find a center from which all other planes of existence start. Where is that center? It is within us. So we started out earlier on looking to see if we could determine where the center of the earth was. We found it, or at least the ancient rishis found it. The ancient sages found that in the innermost core of the human soul is the center of the whole universe. And that's Swami Vivekananda. And lastly, the person who provided the most material for tonight's talk, dear Swami Ranganathanandji, I will quote from his Eternal Values. Something wonderful happens, says the Upanishad, when man succeeds in stilling the senses and the mind. The highest results of all such discipline of the energies of the inner life is total illumination. This is the consummation of human evolution, says Vedanta. So with that, my salutations to Swami Vivekananda, Paramahansa Yogananda, and dear Swami Ranganathanandji.